Coming up on today's show.
What I want to share today, I have a few ideas about setting goals and how we can integrate those celebrations all along the way.
Sometimes, we know the little steps help us get started, but I also know that once you get started, sometimes it's easy to get sidetracked. So I want to talk about that too.
With all those things that went on, you still kept your eye on the goal.
Yeah.
And now here you are, 300th podcast,
Setting and celebrating big goals. It's keeping you organized. Coming up next. Well, hello and welcome to Keeping You Organized. It's been a while since we've done a show that we hadn't recorded 3 or 4 months ago. We're in the middle of a pandemic, but we are recording this. I'm recording this from my basement right now, but it's a big deal because we are starting our 8th season of our show and the 300th episode. So who do I want to bring in to celebrate? Linda Samuels. Oh, so organized. Now, did you bring me a cake or not?
Well, it's a surprise.
Oh, okay. Well, that's good. Well, Linda, welcome to Keeping You Organized.
Thanks so much for having me. And what a pleasure and honor it is to be here for the 300th podcast. That's incredible, John.
8 years. We started 7 years ago. We're starting our 8th season. So today, to celebrate that, instead of we're just patting ourselves on the back for the whole show, because that would get really old. But I do want to talk about how milestones in particular, this is a milestone for us,
Sure.
But kind of this whole concept of setting big goals. I've heard people refer to it different. You have they maybe use the rock analogy. You have big rocks, medium rocks, and small rocks. And this, a big rock might be something that is, it's going to take you years to get. And I don't know if we've ever set a goal to do 300 shows or even be around 8 years, but let's talk about that, because you help people with productivity. You help them with all kinds of organizing. What's the role of a big goal?
So if I can backtrack a little if you don't mind, I want to talk a little about these big goals, setting big goals, and how celebration plays a part in them. But to go with that, I wanted to give a little context, which is that I realized, growing up, my parents were the role models of celebrating. I understood and modeled the art of celebration. And in terms of celebrating like milestones, like a big milestone like your 300th podcast, or the birthdays and anniversaries, the comings, the goings, the graduations, this was something that was a regular part of my life. And they did it, with the cake and the flowers and the cards and things like this, meals. But the main thing was, what I got from it was that they knew how to stop and appreciate and understand when something special was happening and figure out a way to mark it and celebrate it.
Yeah, sometimes it seems like celebrations have kind of maybe gone to the wayside. We're so, especially things that have taken many years, right now, Smead, the company I work for, I think is like 114 years old. And back at the 100th anniversary, that was a big deal. That was 14 years ago, though. But, these celebrations, seems like sometimes we just don't do that many anymore.
That's right. And so what I want to share today, I have a few ideas about setting goals and how we can integrate those celebrations all along the way.
Oh, let's do that. That sounds,
okay.
I love a party.
I love a party.
Yeah.
So the first one, I call it birth of a big goal. So where do these big goals come from, right? They come from somewhere. And when I thought about this, to me, usually big goals come from a thought and a list. Okay, the two together. So maybe that thought comes from a conversation, an observation. It could be a daydream, an aha moment. Maybe you discovered a new passion, or you learned something new. But until that thought is committed to paper, it's just a wish. It's not a goal.
Right.
So that's the context that the goal starts at. And in terms of how one might celebrate it, the celebration of that birth is actually writing the list.
Yes.
And
You know,
so, yeah, go ahead.
well, I was going to say that, just in thinking of, the idea of thinking, or, the first word came to my mind was dreaming. And sometimes, like when I go on vacation or I go on a hike or I go somewhere where there's not all the craziness, and maybe this is why we don't do this as much anymore, you get away to have that thinking time where you can think big and not think about what I got to do in the next hour or I got to do here. And I think that having that time to
Yes.
just dream big
Yeah,
is important.
it's important. And then to capture that dream,
Mm.
right? Because otherwise it just stays in the brain. But to put it down somewhere, that starts to put other things in motion. And so um, consider the perspective that crafting that list is the first celebration for setting a big goal.
And do you think, when you're thinking list, are you thinking like kind of what it takes to get to the goal from where you are now? Or is it just anything that might be associated with it?
Anything that might be associated. It doesn't have to be specific. It doesn't have to be in order, but it does need to be captured somewhere.
Yes.
Just needs to be captured. Some people might think of it almost as a brain dump, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Well,
So
what do we
that's
do with the list then?
okay. So the next one I call big goal takes small steps. And I know you've heard this. You've had 300 conversations with professional organizers and productivity consultants, so you know all about the small steps. But we don't get to the big goal by one big giant leap, right? It takes micro actions and mini goals to reach that big goal. So going back to that list that I just mentioned, that big goals begin with a thought and a list. So it's at this point that list then gets refined and actually starts to turn into these mini actions, these mini doable actions. So, years ago I wrote a book, and that was a huge goal for me. It took a long time for me from the idea of doing it to when it happened, but there were lots of components like the writing, the editing, the publishing, marketing, and each phase got divided into these little tiny steps until finally the big goal happened, and there I had my book.
Right. Yeah, that's a really, I think it's a great point. And we're going to take a quick break here. And when we come back, I want to get more into that because, getting the steps down, I think is good. Sometimes, we know the little steps help us get started, but I also know that once you get started, sometimes it's easy to get sidetracked. So I want to talk about that too when we come back. So we're with Linda Samuels, Oh So Organized, talking about setting big goals and how you achieve them and celebrating them as well. And we'll be right back.
The Organized Home Office from MyOrganized.life. When you work from home, your workspace doesn't have to be bland and boring. Brighten up your home office with organizing solutions from MyOrganized.life. It's just for you. MyOrganized.life. MyOrganized.life.
We are back on Keeping You Organized, talking about setting and celebrating big goals because this is our 300th podcast and we're starting season number 8 here on Keeping You Organized. And we're with Linda Samuels, Oh So Organized. And Linda, you've been with us, I think, I can't remember if it was like show number 10 or 12. You were right in the very beginning. All along. You and Leslie Josell, and we had, Geraldine and the whole gang. Really were there, we all looked a lot different back then, but we're still here.
That's right. We're still here. We're still setting goals. We're still getting organized, right?
Yes. Now, I didn't know, 8 years ago if that was something that we were even going to accomplish. So this wasn't a big goal, but I do remember back when we talked about, how do we reach out to people? This was an inner discussion in our marketing department, and back, 7-8 years ago, podcasts were just starting to get popular. And it's one of those things where with a podcast, you can have it almost like have a discussion like you're having in your living room, like you and I are having right now. Sure. And so it's very intimate. And it's a great way to connect and communicate with people. So Absolutely. Anyway, but we're talking about, we've got the dream, we've got the lists.
Yep.
What's kind of our next step?
So our next step, oh, I just want to go back if I can, just one
Okay.
second back to the small steps, which is that the celebration part of that is that you really want to develop that awareness of those small steps and reaching those small goals and learn to celebrate them. Because by doing that, it's going to help you reduce your overwhelm and sustain your motivation over time.
Yes.
Which is what you were saying. It's hard to sustain these really long goals. So to help do that along the way, you celebrate them. And that, in the case of the little goals, the celebrate could be just high five, do an air high five these days, right?
Yeah.
Or just stopping to acknowledge that progress. So.
Yeah, I remember at the end of season 1, you can go back still if you go to smead.com/podcast and scroll way down to the bottom. We used to do like highlights of season 1. We did
Yes.
that for a few years. We haven't done that in the last couple of years. I don't know why, but that was kind of our way of celebrating even the short term.
I love that. And it's funny, I was just looking at one of those the other day too. So yeah.
Awesome. Okay, so what's next?
Okay, so the next one is called Your Goal Has Character. Okay.
I'm sure they do.
I'm sure they do. So when you're setting a big goal, it's important to understand the nature of the goal because that is going to influence many things. Now, the way that I look at it is there are flexible big goals and non-flexible big goals. So, for instance, a flexible goal might be something like you want to declutter your entire house because eventually, and the word eventually, that's the qualifier, eventually you want to sell your home. So it's not date driven. There's a goal in mind. It's a big goal, but you have some fudge room in terms of how long that's going to take.
Right.
As opposed to a non-flexible goal, you decided you want to sell your home and now you have to be out by closing, right? Like the new people are coming in, you've got to get out. So that's the kind of thing where you don't have room for, the goal, it's got a date and that date could add a sense of urgency. So these two kinds of goals will affect how you're moving through to that end process. And needless to say, when there is a date and a specific deadline, generally your motivation's a lot higher.
Yes.
And in addition, it can happen a lot more quickly too. So something to consider when you're setting goals. Do you even need to create a false sense of urgency to create some of that that movement forward? Or are you okay knowing that it's a big goal, but you're just going to take your time in doing it,
Yeah. And a lot of our, time management episodes that we've talked about and productivity, setting a date and time on maybe those lower level tasks are always good because that does give you motivation to get those things done. And, I think that's really important in the whole big process.
It is, but I think it's, again, knowing what really that big goal is, because sometimes we're okay just kind of meandering along to get there.
Right.
As opposed to that. So I think that in terms of the celebration for that type of goal, I would just say embrace the character of it. So if it's one of those non-flexible goals, just enjoy the fact that it's happening quickly, that it's happening like tomorrow or whenever it's happening. And if it's one of the flexible goals, maybe celebrate the fact that you can savor that journey a little more.
Yeah.
So.
All right. What happens if life gets in the way?
Yes, that's the next one. Life shocks the goal. Oh, did you know that? You just fed me that one?
Oh, come on, Linda.
So yes. So isn't it interesting how life does get in the way? And we were talking a little about that before we started today.
Yeah.
You could have health challenges, loss of a loved one, or a pandemic. I mean, who could have predicted a pandemic, right?
Yes. Now, I know.
Yeah. And all of these things do affect and have an effect on those big goals. So there's two things that can happen. It can derail the big goal, or in fact, it can clarify a big goal. Yes. So, we don't always react the same way. So for example, wedding celebrations. I know you spoke about a wedding celebration pre-pandemic. We have one happening like soon during the pandemic.
Nice.
Job changes, renovations. We talked a little about that, right?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. And these things, because of some big life happening, can get postponed or canceled or just reimagined. But
Right.
it derails maybe the trajectory of that goal was going to be or how it was going to happen.
Yeah, it's interesting because so last December we had the fire in the house, and some of the people who listen and watch the show regularly know that. And February, the daughter's wedding. March, the pandemic, and so it's like all these changes happening. And but we're still doing the show somehow. We did cut back this summer to once a month. And moving forward, we got some new things going on. We may do once a month. We may go back to weekly. We don't even know yet because we're still in the process of figuring out what's next.
But what's interesting with what you just said is, with all those things that went on, you still kept your eye on the goal.
Yes.
And now here you are, 300th podcast,
It's
with
amazing.
all this stuff. It is amazing. So,
Right.
but your goal, on the one hand, it can be derailed. It can also be clarified. And I know for me, one of the things that happened was that during the pandemic, I pretty much switched from doing in-person organizing to just doing virtual. And it turns out I love it. So I'm going to be doing a lot more of that. And that was not something that was as obvious to me before the pandemic. So,
and I think people are getting more used to it. I know my mother-in-law, who's in her 90s, she just had a virtual doctor's visit.
Amazing, right?
And those things are becoming more, normal now.
Yeah. So all kinds of things are changing. And I think that sometimes these things that shock our life, that are really difficulties, can work in a positive way too.
Right.
So just something to keep in mind. And, in terms of how do you celebrate that when life shocks your goal, right? And I think for me, what comes to mind is it's really an affirmation of your resilience.
Yes.
And so that's what you're doing. The celebration is that. And, it's where you're exercising more self-compassion, more flexibility, more creativity, and again, more resilience. And those are qualities to celebrate.
Well, and I think thankfulness, just being thankful in all circumstances. That's really kind of I know it's hard, but it always could be a lot worse than it is.
That is for sure. I don't even want to imagine what that might look like, but you're right.
Yeah.
You're right. Yeah.
So, all right. Do you have any other points to go along with our big goal theme today?
I've got one more for you.
Okay.
Okay, you ready? So this one is called Small Goal Grows Up. Okay.
And moves out. No.
And moves out. Moves out. Okay. So sometimes we have a small goal.
Yeah.
And what happens is it morphs into this bigger one. And it wasn't the initially what we conceived of. We thought of it just as a small, maybe experiment, or just let's try this once, but it grew into something larger. So one example is a bunch of years ago, I wrote my first blog post. I decided I wanted to blog. I wrote my first blog post, and I wrote maybe once a month, turned into once a week, turned into hundreds of posts. And last year I celebrated my 10-year blogging anniversary.
Wow.
I know, right?
You're a pioneer at that, because that 10 years ago, that was still really new.
Was it? I don't even remember that. I just know the goal was not, I want to blog for 10 years or I want to write hundreds of posts. It was just, I'm going to do one. And so that turned into this bigger thing. And then I was thinking about this other goal that I guess about 7 years ago, you had this idea of, I'm going to start doing some podcasts, right? Mm-hmm. And I don't know, you even spoke about it earlier when we were talking, that it wasn't this idea that you'd be doing 300, but now you're starting your 8th year, you've reached your 300th podcast.
Right.
And I mean, how spectacular is that, right?
Yeah. Well, I remember back when we had 10, and I was looking at another podcaster who was definitely a pioneer, and they had like 200. I'm going, oh my gosh, 200 podcasts. That is a lot.
It's a lot.
But,
So,
so now we're up at 300, but I suppose they're up at 700 by now or something.
but it doesn't matter. It's really, all goals are relative to what you're doing, and it's not in relationship to. So in terms of these small goals that grow up, how do we celebrate them? And I think one of the best ways that we can do is to celebrate and share them with others.
Yes.
So, I mean, that's really a lot of what we've talked about today, is that, right? We've talked about the 300th, and I would be remiss if I didn't help you celebrate. So
I love it. Nice. Way to go. And you have purple and red, the Smead colors.
That's your Smead colors. That's why when we were talking about that earlier, I was like, oh no.
Yeah. But what's kind of interesting, I don't know what you had to do to get those balloons, because you can't get in the stores half the time. But anyway, no, that's great. Well, Linda, that's a great way to celebrate. Before we go, I want you to tell people how they get a hold of you, and tell us about these virtual services, or what are you doing to help people, even in a pandemic, get organized?
Sure. So, I work with people through Zoom or Skype, and we're doing all kinds of things, from organizing offices to planning time to working on sleep patterns, organizing closets and clothing. And it's actually a wonderful way of working with people. I'm seeing huge progress with this type of work, which is very different, because in virtual organizing, without me physically being with them, the clients are doing the work and taking more ownership and making huge strides. So it's exciting to see.
Yeah. So, and how can we find you?
You can find me easiest way on my website, ohsoorganized.com. And then I'm all over social media too.
Absolutely. Well, Elizabeth, this has been phenomenal. Thank you so much for the balloons. Yoo-hoo-hoo. 300 shows, 8 seasons. Oh my goodness. What's next? Who knows? I guess we have to go for 10 years and 500 shows maybe.
There you go. Big goal.
Yeah, big goals. That's the small one. Turn into big. But all right. Well, Linda, it's great to have you again. And this fall, this is August right now. So this fall, we're going to hopefully have some new things that we're going to be doing. Maybe have a new set if we get back into our building, and so people have something to look forward to. That's one of our goals for this fall.
Sounds great.
Great. And we'll have you back next time.
Thanks so much. Bye, John.
All right. Well, there you have it, folks. I hope you can just take a few moments, turn off the phones, turn off everything, get quiet for a moment, set some big, wild goals, write down your list, and then get ready to celebrate, and then come back for our next episode of Keeping You Organized.